Okay, maybe we should start. So next speaker is Dillon from NYU.
Great, thanks. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. This is a macro-dot-shaped poem, by which we mean not merely a disk or an emblematic circle, which a text so figured might claim meant sun, moon, world, eternity, or perfection. No, just a blown-up dot in lines of 7 up to 29 letters. Past the middle, the lines of type get shorter and move faster, but all adding up to too much fuss about making a point. So here's a poem by the late John Hollander. It's a brilliant poem, in my opinion, for many reasons, but for now, I'll let it introduce the point of my talk today. So every point you have seen in everyday life has had size, has a dimension, whether that dimension is macro or minute. Many domains in human flourishing, in contrast, transcend the physical, transcend what we see. They transcend the physical insofar as they require our reasoning about things that are that go beyond our ability to see. So, for example, infinitely small points and lines that never end. So the foundation of modern science and technology, for example, or Euclidean geometry relies on such concepts. Again, things like infinitely small points and lines that never end. And so the question for today is, how are we humans able to conceive of these infinitesimal points, lines, and figures of Euclidean geometry despite only experiencing the physical scenes and objects of everyday life? So does the origin of our geometric reasoning rely on the perfection of infinitely small points? As John Hollander might have said, no. Indeed, I think we've been making too much fuss about infinitely small points, when we really should be making a fuss over the points that we see, points like this one. So today I'll provide evidence that the spatial intuitions about the physical world that we have both form the foundation of our capacity for abstract reasoning in geometry and also limit that reasoning in very specific ways. So I'll discuss today Euclidean geometry as an example because I believe that the spatial domain is a privileged domain insofar as we're able to, we've learned a lot about what those physical foundations might be from getting from one place to another and recognizing the objects in spaces, but also we know a lot about the formal systems in geometry, and throughout human history we've developed complex and abstract systems that allow us to understand and think differently about the spatial domain. So I'll start by just providing some information about what we know about how we interact with the spaces and objects around us. And these might sound like gross overgeneralizations of the kinds of spatial sensitivities that we have, but I'll describe them at a level of complexity that I think is useful for this discussion and also plays out in the way that children, who will be the focus of my investigation today, the level of analysis that I'll talk about today is something that we can read out pretty reliably in children's behavior. So, for example, the way that we navigate the world, and again, this is just one way to navigate the world, one that sort of sets a kind of cognitive map that mammalian species use to get from one place to another, relies on the distances and directions of the extended surface features in the environment. So here, for example, I have a rectangular chamber, and what you're looking at is the firing pattern of place cells of a rat navigating in this rectangular chamber. There is a distinctive landmark at this short side of the chamber, but as you can see, the place cell firing doesn't care that there is this particular landmark that's breaking the geometry of the space. Rather, it's responding based on the geometry of this rectangle, responding, say, in this corner here, or the diagonally opposite corner that has the same geometric relations. And the rat's behavior is complementary to the neural firing pattern. So if you hide, for example, something very rewarding here in this corner, where there is a distinctive landmark that's breaking the symmetry of the space, the rat will search either at that correct corner or at the diagonally opposite corner, which has the same distance and directional relations as the target location. Again, not incorporating the features of this distinguishing landmark that would break that geometry. So in general, to sort of create a cognitive map of the environment, mammalian species tend to rely on the distance and directional properties of the extended surfaces in the layout. Again, not to say that we can navigate by other kinds of features, but this is sort of the primary information that allows us to create a cognitive map. In contrast, when we're recognizing objects, we tend to rely on we're missing one of our shapes here. this infant is supposed to be looking at two sets of L shapes here. When we're discriminating among objects in visual forms, even from young infancy, we tend to pay attention to information like relative length and angle that defines the shape or part features of objects out in the world. And again, this is not sort of this is an overgeneralization of how shape recognition and shape discrimination actually works, but we can break it down for the purposes of today to basic spatial information like relative length and angle that allows even young infants to discriminate among forms and objects. This is something that grows in its invariance through development. So we're going, by the time we're 2 to 3 years of age, we're able to use shape information in 3D objects to discriminate different kinds of objects. And then by the time we're adults, and even in primate visual cortices, we notice that we have cells that are sensitive to shape information that describe a whole bunch of different visual categories. So this information is something that these sensitivities, these two sets of sensitivities, emerge early in human development and are largely dissociated on whether the act is for navigating large-scale layouts, using information about the extended surface layout, or describing and recognizing the shape information about small-scale objects or visual forms. So while humans share these kinds of sensitivities with other animal species, as wide in variety as newly hatched chickens and zebrafish, in addition to other mammalian species, humans are unique in their capacity to understand and use symbolic relations, symbolic spatial relations presented in maps and pictures. So they're able to look for the first time, untutored, look at overhead perspectives of, say, a room or an object and use the spatial information in that picture to understand the spatial information that's being represented. So I can use a picture to understand, say, whatever it is, the geometry of what's being represented. And so these kinds of sensitivities, again, emerge early in human development and emerge across different cultures. And so the work that I've done, mostly in collaboration with Elizabeth Spelke, has uncovered a surprising link. That the information that we use to interpret spatial symbols is actually rooted in this evolutionarily ancient and early emerging sensitivity to distance and directional information used for navigation and relative length and angle information used for object recognition. So I'll show you sort of how we just made this sort of suggestion through some empirical work. We gave the very same 4-year-old children 2 tasks that probed their use of distance and directional information for navigation and their use of angle and length information for shape recognition. So this is a task that's been used in a wide variety of species, but you can also do it with kids. You place a child in a cylindrical environment inside of which is a rectangular enclosure. You can hide something at one of these corners here. The child closes their eyes, you spin them around, and see where they search. So if the child's able to use the geometry of the layout, they'll search just like we saw in that rat example a couple slides ago. They'll search at the correct target or the diagonally opposite target. So in this particular study, what we did is we presented the very same 4-year-old children with more and more successively square chambers such that we could measure in each individual child their particular sensitivity to distance and direction and get that metric for each child. We also presented children in this study with a shape discrimination task in which they were given 6 figures, one that differed from the rest based on some angle or length property, and by giving them a succession of trials, we were able to measure in individual children their acuity to this kind of spatial information for discriminating among forms. So we had metrics for distance and direction, for navigation of the physical world in a child, for angle and length, for discriminating among forms in the physical world, and we wanted to know how these capacities related to this first uniquely human use of geometric information to interpret symbolic maps. So these very same children were presented with maps that looked like this, so presented at a variety of orientations in these 2 differently fragmented environments. So the map task looked like this. The child stood in the center. They had Mr. Monkey. He was an adorable stuffed animal. I, in one of my many haircuts in graduate school, although I've kind of circled back at this point, you'll see a couple more throughout the presentation. I showed the child one of these pictures here. There was a green dot in the picture, and their job was to place Mr. Monkey on the corresponding green spot in the little array. So these maps, these overhead maps, displayed connected triangular figures that had angle information and also had relative distance information. And we presented these very same maps in these 2 differently fragmented environments. One that highlighted via the use of extended surface features how far away the child was from each of these kinds of features. So they tended to pay attention to distance information when extended surfaces were displayed in the array versus highlighting angle information. So again, if you'll remember, distance information is more indicative of the kind of information we use for navigation, while angle information is more descriptive of the kind of information we use for object recognition. So our question was, were there contributions of each of these two systems in children's first uniquely human use of geometry, which is to say, interpreting overhead symbolic maps? And so the first thing that we found is that there was no relation between children's performance in each of these two tests, and that wasn't surprising to us, given that the argument in the beginning was that these were two dissociable systems using two different kinds of geometric information for two different purposes. We also, somewhat more surprisingly, found no relation between children's performance in the two map environments. This was surprising given that it was the very same maps presented in the very same manner, and the only thing that differed was what information was being highlighted in the environment. So this suggested to us that perhaps children were recruiting different geometric representations when reading the maps in these two different contexts. That being said, you can't make such a positive conclusion from a null finding, so we needed positive evidence that two different kinds of spatial information or representations were being recruited in these two map tasks. And what we found basically was that the kids who were better at navigating were better at reading the maps in the environment that highlighted distance information, while the children who were better at discriminating among visual forms with angle and length information were better at reading the very same maps in environments that highlighted angle information. So again, this sort of suggested to us that while we have these two dissociable systems for moving from place to place in the physical world and recognizing objects in the physical world, we were able to use both of them, recruit them flexibly for this uniquely human spatial task, dependent on the context in which those spatial symbols were presented. So you might be thinking, oh, Molly, those are really strange maps, and these are 4-year-olds. This dissociation might be something that's artificial based on the kinds of things that you were showing children. Well, again, the many haircuts of Molly Dillon's graduate career would suggest that we tried this a couple of different times in a couple of different ways, making our spatial symbols look more or less like the real world. So, for example, kids who were presented with perspectival pictures of scenes versus objects. These kids also did the navigation and form recognition task. Kids who were better at navigating in that rectangular navigation task were better at interpreting pictures of scenes, and kids who were better at analyzing visual forms based on their angle and length information were better at interpreting pictures of objects. We even measured what happens when you vary the information in the pictures in a room that includes both objects and layout information. And children basically garnered no benefit in getting both types of information in their pictures. They searched more effectively based on the type of spatial information that was most descriptive of a particular target location. So, for example, there was a bin at the other side of the room next to the door. Kids who got pictures like this would search next to either one of those bins. But kids who got pictures like this would search no better than those children who got only the object information to this location versus the bin by the door. So in other words, they weren't integrating information about the door with the bin next to the door and the window with the bin next to the window. The kids who got information just about the bin used that more relevant type of information, but garnered no additional benefit of what was provided in the scene information in the pictures. So again, suggesting that despite children's evolutionarily extraordinarily ability to read maps and pictures, they nevertheless don't integrate information from the different geometries they use for navigation and object recognition. So their symbolic geometry, while relying on these evolutionarily ancient capacities, is still too impoverished to support the complex spatial relations of formal geometry, which integrates distance information with angle information. As you can see by this little GIF here, you need to take into account how the properties of an angle in a triangle relates to the distance properties of the triangle. And so while this first set of studies shows how we humans go from scenes and objects in the physical world to scenes and objects in maps and pictures, it also raises a new question about how we go from spatial symbols to that quintessence of human thought, abstract geometry. So if children's use of spatial symbols is a first step, perhaps, in towards abstract thinking in formal geometry, perhaps it's the case that we can chart changes in children's map reading that might be revelatory of this kind of development and related to their ability to reason more abstractly or more explicitly about the properties of Euclidean geometry. So we did a study like this as well, where we tested 32 6, 10, and 12-year-old children, and we looked for changes in their map reading that might be descriptive or predictive of their ability to reason about the general properties of planar figures like triangles. So what we found is that as children got older, if you remember the 4-year-old children, we had evidence that they used 2 different kinds of spatial information to read the very same maps in these 2 contexts. By the time children got to be 10 years of age, their performance in these 2 map tasks correlated with one another, and there was an even stronger correlation at age 12 years. And we found that by age 12 years as well, their ability to read maps was predictive of their reasoning explicitly about the general properties of triangles. So let me tell you a little bit about this reasoning task. So children were presented, yes?
Quick question. When
Yes.
you say it was predictive, do you mean after
Correlated.
you parceled out other things like G or GPA or whatever you could do with
Yeah.
physical?
So we couldn't partial out everything, but we did have a receptive vocabulary task that we partialed out. So that was it. And in the other task, when we were correlating performance in the map, performance in navigation to say the map that highlighted distance information, we partialed out performance in the form analysis task and performance in the map task that highlighted angle, as well as receptive vocabulary. This one just had receptive vocabulary. Other questions? Okay, so let me tell you a little bit more about this reasoning task. So children were presented with a magnetic whiteboard on which there were movable displays. So they saw this starting position, these bottom 2 corners of a triangle. They were taken through a whole procedure in which we talked about these little segments here as rows that met at little towns. I can tell you, to foreshadow some questions, that we tried many, many different kinds of linguistic descriptions, and we always got the same result. So we tried pointiness, and we tried sort of wideness, we tried all sorts of different ways to describe the task, and the results were pretty consistent. So children would see these bottom 2 corners, and we would make 4 kinds of transformations to them. We would move them farther apart, and we would literally pick up the pieces and move them. We would move them closer together, we would increase the angle size, and we would decrease the angle size. And after each one of these transformations, we would ask sets of questions. One set of questions was about what would happen to the implied 3rd corner location after a certain transformation, so whether that corner would move up, move down, or stay in the same place. And we also asked about the angle size at that 3rd corner, whether it would get bigger, get smaller, or stay the same size. And again, there are all sorts of ways you might be able to conceive of that question and all sorts of confusions that you might have. Suffice it to say, we tried those things and we weren't able to get children to perform much better on this task. We had pretty reliable patterns of results across age. And this task was modeled after Euclid's Book 1, Proposition 32, which is outlining how the internal angles of a triangle sum to a constant. So this quintessential example of invariance of shape information. We were curious whether children were able to make judgments that fell in line with this important property of triangles. So the results of this study showed huge developmental changes in children's judgments about the 3rd corner angle. In particular, these bars are probably a little bit hard to see from where you are. Chance was 33%, so it's right about here. And in green are the 6-year-old children who are performing systematically below chance on these questions about angles. So for example, if you ask them what happened to the 3rd corner angle when these 2 corners got bigger, they would say that 3rd corner got bigger too. Okay? Or if you ask them what happened to the 3rd corner when these 2 corners moved farther apart, they would say that the 3rd corner got bigger. So they were making judgments that were in stark contrast to this idea that angles were conserved within connected planar figures. By age 10, they did much better on this question of what happens to the third corner when these corners get bigger. They were able to accurately say that this top one got smaller, but they still made the error that when the whole shape got bigger, they suggested that this top corner could get bigger too. Not until about age 12 years did children get that question right, and still they were only at about 57, 58%. So a lot of children were still getting this wrong, even though they were significantly above chance. So this pattern, this developmental change, is not the first study to obtain these kinds of results, and I'll get to that in just a second. But it was clear that there was this huge developmental change, and I, at this point, was somewhat unsatisfied by what this developmental change meant, because it was totally unclear what the mental representation was that was underlying this change. What were children doing at age 6, age 10, and age 12 that allowed them to make or suggested that they should make judgments like this? So prior work had suggested that not only should we be thinking that by the time we reach adulthood that we're pretty perfect at Euclidean reasoning, and my data said that we weren't, it said that we had actually probably this inferential system based on geometry that emerged probably even earlier in human development. So for example, seminal work by Barbara Landau and colleagues, for example, explored the trajectories of a young blind child who was walked from one location and then to the next location, and then had to turn the correct angle and then walk the correct distance back to her starting location. And in that paper was the suggestion that, quote, our research indicates that the locomotion of the young blind child is guided by, and these emphases are mine, knowledge of the Euclidean properties of a spatial layout, and by principles for making inferences based on these properties. So a rather rich, these authors suggested a rather rich representation of Euclidean geometry that was guiding that child's behavior, even by the time they were about 3 to 4 years of age. Veronique Izard and colleagues found that adults from the US and France, as well as adults from the remote Amazonian tribe of Munduruku, could complete triangles on a computer screen, so they saw stimuli like this, could complete triangles on a computer screen in a way that preserved the rules of Euclidean geometry. And so their suggestion was similar in that there were these representations that were rich enough to provide inferences about the Euclidean properties of shapes that emerged through human development universally, but took until about age 10 to 12 years to come about. The young children in their studies also were not producing the third corner location of this triangle in line with Euclidean rules. So these studies suggest that we have knowledge about Euclidean geometry and can make principled sort of inferences about these properties. But again, I'm sort of unconvinced, especially seeing these data here that we obtained in our study. I was sort of doubtful that we were all these little Euclids and that we had these perfect Euclidean rules already in our heads. So motivated by this questioning of what was this developmental change about and what were the mental representations that were guiding this change and guiding our reasoning, we teamed up with Maha and his postdoc. So Liz and I teamed up with Maha and his postdoc, Yuval Hart and some other members of the lab, to ask what is the gradient of this sort of mental representation that might be driving reasoning, and can we characterize mature geometric reasoning and figure out what's going on here? So we conducted a task that was very similar to the task that I just showed you, that we had done with 6, 10, and 12-year-old children, where we presented adults now with static displays of the bottom 2 corners of a triangle, but we made the same kinds of transformations verbally. We told them that the bottom 2 corners would move out, move in, the angles would get bigger and get smaller. And we observed sort of an interesting pattern in the way that they responded, insofar as adults were less accurate when things got bigger versus smaller, and they were also slower when things got bigger versus smaller. So this was the first sort of suggestion to us that the ways that adults were reasoning about these scale invariant properties, in terms of the Euclidean sense, scale invariant properties of triangles were indeed not scale invariant at all. They were relying on the description of the shape transformations, whether or not things were getting bigger and smaller, and using that information to make their judgments, such that when things got bigger, there was more noise introduced in their representations, they would be less accurate, and they would take longer to respond. So we were also interested in how the scale-dependent process might relate to these basic perceptual completion properties of triangles that we all are sort of able to do when we're given fragmented stimuli. So we gave a separate group of adults a localization task, and they produced triangles that Euclid might not have been too proud of. So these adults were given the bottom two corners of a triangle and simply asked to locate where the third corner would be given these two corners. And we characterized how the noise accumulated with the scale of the triangle. And with a correlated random walk model, we could kind of break up two different kinds of noise properties of this completion process that allowed us to learn more about how these individuals were completing the triangle. So there was an element of random noise that was associated with sort of moving along the trajectory of the extrapolation or the simulation. And there was a global correction factor that happened for each individual at a particular time scale that allowed the individual to get closer or farther away from the accurate location. But what was distinctive about this completion process is that it wasn't like slapping down one single line from corner to top that had a noise parameter around it. Rather, it was this kind of dynamic process that incorporated elements of local noise as well as a global correction factor. That global correction factor, however, was sort of aiming at trying to incorporate what the overall trajectory, that bottom corner angle should be, and sort of creating a kind of side of a triangle that maintained the important property that sides should be straight and oriented at a given angle. So inherent in this global correction factor was the idea that here are some basic properties of Euclidean reasoning or Euclidean properties of space that are incorporated into the simulation, even though there's not this high-level, abstract level of Euclidean representation that's guiding the way that we complete triangles. So this global correction factor maintained the orientation of the given angle and maintained sort of the overall idea that this line should be a straight trajectory, even though the actual unfolding of the extrapolation didn't have those overarching properties. And so with the team together, we created a computational model of this visual completion, and we found that if we use this model to predict adults' reasoning responses, we found that it actually well predicted the way that adults reasoned about the general properties of triangles. So in addition to having this evidence that reasoning was scale dependent, that adults took a longer time to respond and performed more poorly on transformations that were larger versus smaller to the triangle, which suggested the use of a scale-dependent, potentially simulation process. We also had this independent evidence that our model for simulation of simple triangle completion was related to the way, or at least was predictive of the way, that adults were reasoning explicitly about the properties of triangles. So the argument here is that adults are not Euclid either, right? So in that case, if adults aren't Euclid, and we have this sort of evidence that there is this scale-dependent kind of visualization, visual simulation reasoning strategy that's going on, that's underlying their explicit judgments, then what becomes of the developmental story that I told a couple of slides ago? How do we explain that? So what we decided to do was to take this task to a bunch of kids between the ages of 7 to 12 years of age and present them with both tasks. So present them with the explicit reasoning task and the visual simulation task, and see if there were properties of those simulations within the very same child that would be predictive of their explicit reasoning. And I should mention that we conducted this study at the National Museum of Mathematics, which is in New York City. If you guys haven't visited it, you definitely should. There are all sorts of fun things, like you can spin around in chairs like this, and you can also shoot baskets against a physics machine, and I did much better than the physics machine, I'm very happy to say. But I had played basketball for the first 18 years of my life, so perhaps that was the explanation. Anyway, it's a fun place to be. So we conducted this study at the National Museum of Mathematics, and we targeted children who were between the ages of 7 and 12 years, which, if you remember, is the age range where we saw that developmental change a couple of studies ago. So First, we predicted that the global correction factor, which incorporates these basic Euclidean properties of space, would change as children got older. Maybe that was it. Maybe there's the simulation process that's going into our reasoning, and this essential component that incorporates things like angle size and trajectories is what's changing through development, and that explains the developmental change in reasoning. And we also thought that we could maybe measure in each individual child how their use of that global correction factor, how that predicted how good they were at reasoning explicitly about the properties of triangles. So the first prediction was wrong, and the second prediction, at least, was only half wrong. So let me tell you how that happened. So what we found is that this global correction factor, which we thought might improve with age, actually didn't. So the young children, just as much as the older children, incorporated this property into their visual simulations, and even in adults, so we tested a post hoc group of 30 adults, the property still hadn't changed by then. So this idea that they were able to incorporate the angle information that was given at the bottom corner and the maintenance of a straight line was something that was developmentally stable. So what did change? Well, if we look at the variance or the standard deviation of children's responses on the reasoning task, we see that there's a huge developmental shift in the variation of children's responding to that task at about age 10 years. So what does this suggest to us? There's stability in their incorporation of the Euclidean properties of their simulations, basic Euclidean properties of their simulation, but again we find developmental changes in their explicit reasoning and this huge change in the variability of their reasoning at about age 10 years. So if you guys remember, I suggested in an earlier study that children who were the youngest were making responses to these reasoning questions that were running in line to this idea, or running opposite to the idea of simulation, right? So if I'm making these corners bigger, no simulation is going to give you the idea that this corner also gets bigger. So they're running in contrast to the idea of simulation, and in fact are running in line with the idea that young children might be using size-based rules to make explicit judgments about the properties of triangles. And that older children, like adults, might instead be relying on simulation-based strategies for their reasoning that incorporates, on an individual level, this idea of angle maintenance and side straightness. And so if this were the case, then we might predict that in the older children, but not the younger children, that we might find the same patterns of scale dependence in the explicit reasoning in the older children, but not the younger children. And indeed, this is what we found. So we found a relation between children's extrapolation process and their reasoning in the older children and not the younger children. And we also found that older children, but not younger children, were less accurate when the triangles got bigger, and slower when the triangles got bigger versus when the triangles got smaller. And these patterns weren't present in the data with the younger children. So again, the suggestion is that the developmental change that we see in children's explicit reasoning about the general properties of triangles is not a change in their capacity for using Euclidean properties for mental simulation or thinking about shapes in a particular way, but rather their adoption of a simulation-based strategy for reasoning explicitly versus a size-based rule strategy for reasoning. And so was there any difference in the simulations between younger kids and older kids that might have forced them into these two different kinds of strategies? Perhaps. So younger children had more local noise in their simulations, and that might have been sort of a cue for them to, explicitly or implicitly, a cue for them to not rely on simulation, noticing this high level of noise in the way that they were representing shape information. Versus the older children who had lower levels of random local noise that perhaps encouraged that, okay, maybe simulation was a good strategy to use. Of course, you can kind of test this experimentally by introducing noise into the stimuli, into the displays for older children and adults, and see if that sort of flips them to a different kind of strategy in the way they reason about shapes. Okay, so essential to this idea of simulation that's already present in young children is this idea that their straight sides and linearity is a really important property of shapes. So I'll just give you a brief sort of hint of an idea of some of the other studies that are happening in my lab right now. We're sort of maximizing on the idea that infants have expectations about agents who move from place to place in their environment, and they move efficiently towards these goals in their environment. And so I think this might be an opportunity to sort of figure out what kind of spatial information infants are using to make these inferences about efficiency. In particular, sort of gauging their sensitivity to paths that move straight ahead without turning versus paths that are sort of less efficiently moving from one place to another on a variety of different surfaces, including planar surfaces, which are the most common in terms of sort of the way that we probe children's intuitions about space, but also spherical surfaces. So the kinds of things that one might not encounter in formal schooling unless you're a math major and in year 2 or 3 of your undergraduate education. Nevertheless, the argument is that there may be sensitivities to this kind of information emerging early in human development that's playing out in other sorts of domains of human knowledge, for example, evaluating efficient action. So the basic research theory is suggesting that we have these sensitivities to basic properties of the spatial physical world, and they're at the foundation of our capacity for reasoning abstractly in line with formal or school-like geometry. And so the best test case of this kind of argument is to ask whether training these kinds of spatial sensitivities in young children actually causes new knowledge to grow, school-relevant knowledge to grow, in the context in which children are actually living and learning. So we conducted, sort of along the lines of this kind of search for causal mechanisms, we conducted a large-scale randomized control trial in which we presented a bunch of 4-year-old children with games that exercised their sensitivities to numerical and spatial information, the kind of stuff that had been unearthed in laboratory research by many, many investigators over the past 10 to 15 years. We saw that exercising these kinds of early emerging sensitivities not only strengthen those sensitivities, but also allow children to acquire symbolic information about the spatial and numerical world when they were presented with it in preschool and in primary school. So in this first randomized controlled trial, where we presented children with these games, it was over a 4-month period where children played the games for 1 hour, 3 times a week, under the supervision of teachers who had been trained just to implement these games. They were local individuals who received no formal training or high-level training in mathematics, education, or psychology. These were local folks who implemented the game. We found that children who received these math games performed better in their intuitive capacities for number and geometry compared to a group who had received social games, as well as a no treatment control. And at least 1 to 3 months after this intervention, they also improved in their probably simultaneously acquired capacity for sort of symbolic recognition of numbers and shape names. So they were better, for example, at identifying a shape by its name, even though that kind of information was not directly trained in the intervention. However, 6 months and then 12 months after that, while children's intuitive capacities for number and geometry remained higher in the math group compared to the other 2 groups, that transfer to symbolic mathematical gain went away. So this is not an unusual story in kind of intervention research, but it motivated us, given sort of the promise of our first set of findings, to sort of try again and see if we might be able to sustain that transfer to symbolic gains on the longer term. In the second intervention, we presented one group of children with a mix of symbolic and non-symbolic content or intuitive content in their games. And these children, 12 months after the intervention ended, were both improved in their intuitive capacities and also their symbolic capacities. I should note that these effect sizes are smaller in intervention 2 compared to intervention 1, but it actually turns out to maybe be something that's good about the scenario, and that the teachers in the local context started to pick up on all of the wonderful exercises that were being engaged in children in the local area, and so the non-treatment control kids also started exercising their intuitive capacities for number and geometry, bumping them up a little bit and dampening our effect sizes for intervention too. But so it goes. Okay, so foundations and limitations. So I hope I convinced you at least a little bit today that our evolutionarily ancient geometry that we share with other animal species also underlies humans, uniquely humans' symbolic spatial capacity. So these are the kinds of things that emerge early in human development, are untrained in our first use of spatial information that goes beyond what other animals can do. Limitations, however, these geometric sensitivities must work together for formal geometry, and in young children we see that they're really staying separate from one another. In terms of foundations, mental simulation appears to underlie mature geometric reasoning, but mental simulation is not scale invariant. So we're pretty good at reasoning about the general properties of triangles under all sorts of different kinds of transformations, but if pushed to making judgments about small things and big things, we do see evidence that there is this scale dependence in the way that we make judgments about triangles, for example. And perhaps that even though there seems to be this Euclidean property, maintenance of angles and straight sides in young children's mental simulations, there may be other things about their simulations that are suggesting against the use of that strategy in young kids versus older kids. In terms of foundations, geometric intuitions may support early emerging knowledge in diverse domains. So again, we make judgments about, say, agents moving efficiently towards their goals, and hidden in those kinds of judgments may be specific kinds of geometric intuitions that are interesting and map on to formal geometry in ways that might be good to know. That said, harnessing those geometric intuitions for more general reasoning might be challenging. In terms of foundations, some of our intervention evidence suggests that intuitions are about geometry and number as well, are causally related to formal knowledge growth. However, our second intervention suggested that only when training exercises both intuitions and formalisms does knowledge growth persist. Thank you very much.
Questions?
So this is a very broad question. You did touch on it a little bit, but I mean, it's very tempting to think about the improved abilities in abstract geometric thinking in children as kind of developmentally connected to their, growing neuroscience, growing neural structures, like Nita was talking about before. There's some very specific connections that were very interesting, but it somehow seems wrong to assume that people are capable of abstract geometric thought kind of when they become mature, when in fact for the first 150,000 years of human history, nobody had formulated the idea of similar triangles or any of the ideas that kids are taught in fifth grade nowadays. So there's sort of something missing, like the cultural inculcation that that we see in schools that is required in addition to bring people to the abstract geometric thought you're talking about. Could you just
Absolutely. So I think the main argument, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about this, is that I don't think we're doing abstract geometric reasoning, right? So I think the whole point is that when asked to do everyday reasoning about infinitely small points and lines that never end, we're talking about physical points and lines that have width and have ends, right? So the idea, when we're thinking about how to maybe scaffold formal learning into sort of intuitions that kids or adolescents might already have, is to take into account that they're probably not making judgments on the basis of abstraction. They're probably instantiating sort of kind of their physical intuitions based on whatever they're being shown or wherever they're able to imagine based on what you say. So I think you're absolutely right.
You were very clear about that.
Okay.
I don't need to apply otherwise. But like you talked about the strategy change at the 10-year-old threshold between the earlier strategy and the later strategy. So maybe I misunderstood, but didn't that later strategy in some way relate to, Euclid? Or is it in some sense closer to what people think when they read the elements?
I think that, so it's closer, but it's still scale dependent, right? So if you push an adult, if you push an older child, you can measure in an individual how much longer it takes them to do the very same, scale invariant transformation in the context of Euclid in a scale dependent way, right? So the internal angle summing to a constant shouldn't matter whether that thing gets bigger or gets smaller, but in older children and adults, as long as you're using a sensitive enough methodology, you can measure that difference. And that's the suggestion that I think I'm trying to make. Yeah.
We would take the opposite approach. Is there another type of geometry that's a better fit, a non-Euclidean geometry?
I don't know. So some of the models suggest that there is an element of curvature that goes into the way that we complete triangles. There's some info from the kind of perception literature that we may have sort of curvature in our visual system to begin with, and that's the way that we see. I don't know if there's been any. There have been trends in data that have suggested that there's a type of curvature in the way that we complete triangles, but I'm not sure if that extends to mapping to a formal system of non-Euclidean geometry, right? So there are properties of the way that we complete triangles that are non-Euclidean or not Euclidean, but it's not quite clear if that makes a non-Euclidean geometry more intuitive. I don't know if Maha has any thoughts on this.
I would agree exactly
Yeah.
what you said.
Yeah.
I mean,
It's a difference between sort of a perceptual level and a conceptual level. Even if there seems to be a certain property in the perception, it's far afoot from making judgments about what's the most conceptually intuitive geometry, right? That we would use to reason.
I mean, it's certainly I just add something.
Yeah,
It's
sure.
certainly true that there are more non-Euclidean geometries than Euclidean geometries, because there are infinite numbers. But we don't see, at least in the experiments, a need to essentially evoke that additional complexity.
Right.
So there's this work by Bill Geisler talking about contour completion by humans, and he basically tries to relate completion of contours, all of which triangles are a specific case, to the statistics of contours in the world. He does measures lots of the contours and then asks how people complete. Could you comment on the relationship, if any? So there, that's if you read it on the surface, it sounds like you infer a prior experience of the world and then apply it as opposed to having some intrinsic notion of geometry.
Yeah, I think that this idea of shape completion is probably something that is pretty basic, that can rely on this kind of Gestalt properties of the way that we see. The particular characterization of the sort of the way that we do it, that it unfolds over time, that it has these two kinds of error terms that are well characterized by correlated random walk with local noise and a global correction factor. I think that's maybe there have been models that have looked at individual line extrapolations and stuff like that, but I think all I can maybe say is that the way that we're trying to use these kinds of completion processes, these visual completion processes, is looking for commonalities between what they have and how we might use them to reason. So it's sort of less about how do we fill in the missing properties of occluded objects, for example, and how does Gestalt work in vision, but more about given that we're able to do these kinds of things, how might we recruit them when we're trying to think abstractly about shapes?
Thank you very much.